Camden Town, London, England, September 12, 1907. Bertram Shaw comes home from work at 11:30 in the morning. He has been on the night shift, working as a chef in the restaurant car of the Sheffield Express, and he's been away since the previous evening. He climbs the stairs to the ground floor flat at 29 St. Paul's Road. The door is locked. That's strange. Emily never locks the door when she's home. He borrows a key from the landlady, Mrs. Stocks. He opens the door. And what Bertram Shaw finds inside that flat will follow him for the rest of his life. Emily Dimmock is lying on the bed, naked, slightly on her left side, her right hand resting on the pillow, her left arm pulled awkwardly behind her. The sheet is pulled partway over her. Her hair is still in the curling pins she wore to bed, the kind of small domestic detail that makes the scene simultaneously ordinary and devastating, the evidence of a woman who expected to wake up in the morning and take them out. And her throat has been cut from ear to ear, so deeply that her head is nearly severed from her body. The remains of a supper eaten by two people are on the table. A basin on the washstand is full of bloody water, with one of Emily's flannel petticoats folded into it, used, the examination would later establish, to clean the killer's hands before they left. One of Bertram's own straight razors is near the sink, traces of recent use on the blade but no blood under the microscope when it's examined more carefully. The room has been ransacked, postcards from Emily's collection scattered across the floor, drawers pulled out. The house keys are gone. The front door was locked from outside. The killer walked out, locked the door behind them with Emily's own keys, and disappeared into a London September morning. Emily Dimmock was 22 years old. She had been murdered in her sleep, sometime between 3 and 6 in the morning, while the man she was going to marry was on a train to Sheffield. His mother was due to visit that same morning, coming to meet the woman her son wanted to marry, arriving to find a locked door, a borrowed key, and everything she had feared about this relationship confirmed in the worst possible way. This case became one of the most sensational criminal trials in Edwardian England, the decade that opened the 20th century in Britain, a period of relative prosperity and social confidence that was also, underneath its polished surface, a time of rigid class divisions, limited rights for women, and a press that had learned exactly how to turn a dead woman into a story without ever really asking who she was. The trial of the man accused of Emily's murder put a charming, well-connected artist in the dock at the Old Bailey, the central criminal court in London where the country's most serious criminal cases are tried. It produced one of the most celebrated courtroom performances in British legal history. The man accused walked free after a jury deliberated for 15 minutes. He went on to tour the country telling audiences about his ordeal. The women who'd testified against him lost their jobs and their homes. And Emily Dimmock's murder was never solved. So here's where this episode is going. Who was Emily Dimmock? Before the newspapers decided what kind of woman she was. What does the evidence actually show about the night she died? And what does it fail to show? And after a century of artists, lawyers, and armchair detectives making this case about everything except her, does the documented record give us any real answer about who killed her? This is Enter the Crime, global true crime told like a documentary. Consider subscribing before we go any further, because this one has layers that take time to properly unfold. Before we go back to the beginning of Emily's life, I want to say one thing about why this case still matters more than a century after it happened. The Camden Town murder is not famous because of the victim. It is famous because of the trial. It is famous because of Edward Marshall Hall's performance, because of the judge's controversial summing up, because Robert Wood was the first murder defendant in British legal history to testify in his own defense and be acquitted. Those are the facts that ended up in legal textbooks and criminal history books. Emily Dimmock's name is not in those books in the same way. She appears as the occasion for those facts, the body in the flat that set the legal machinery in motion, rather than as the person at the center of the story. This episode is going to try to correct that, at least partly not by solving the case that the documented record is honest about the limits of what we can know, but by starting where we should have always started. With whom Emily actually was, before the night of September 12th made her into something the press and the legal system could use. But to understand what happened to Emily Dimmock on the night of September 11th, 1907, we need to go back to the beginning of her life, and to the particular corner of Edwardian London she'd made her home. Camden Town in 1907 is a working-class neighborhood in the inner north of London, not fashionable, not prosperous, not the kind of place that appeared in society pages or travel writing. It sits roughly 2 miles north of the City of London's financial center, close enough to the mainline railway termini at St. Pancras and King's Cross that it's full of railway workers, laborers, lodging house keepers, and the particular floating population of a city neighborhood connected to everywhere and belonging properly to nowhere. The streets around St. Paul's Road, a terraced Victorian street of the kind that existed in thousands across London in this period, are dense, noisy, and after dark, lively in ways that polite Edwardian society preferred not to examine too closely. There are pubs on most corners. There are music halls nearby. There are women who work the street after the pubs close. Camden Town in 1907 is also, and this matters for what this case became, an artist's neighborhood. Walter Sickert, one of the most significant British painters of the early 20th century, a student of Whistler and a friend of Degas, whose Camden Town studio at 6 Mornington Crescent was a 5-minute walk from the Eagle pub on Royal College Street, had been painting the interiors, music halls, and street life of Camden Town for years by the time Emily Dimmock was murdered. The area attracted a particular kind of artistic sensibility drawn to the unglamorous, the working class, the morally complicated lives that more respectable parts of London didn't advertise. The contrast between the artistic community that found Camden Town beautiful and the working-class community that simply lived there runs straight through the middle of this case and everything that followed from it. Emily Elizabeth Dimmock was not born into any of this. She came from the village of Standon, a small settlement in Hertfordshire, a rural county north of London, mostly farmland and market towns, where her father ran the Red Lion pub. Born on October 20, 1884, the youngest of several children, she spent her childhood in the particular world of a rural English pub family, close-knit, working-class, respectable in the way that working-class respectability meant in the 1880s and 90s, not wealthy, but stable, with a place in the community and no particular reason to expect what was coming. She left Hertfordshire in her late teens, as many young women from similar backgrounds did, and moved to London. The city in 1904 and 1905, for a girl with no particular trade and limited education, offered a narrow range of options: domestic service, factory work, lodging house work. Emily tried domestic service. It didn't take. At some point in her late teens, she ended up lodging in a house in Camden Town run by a petty criminal named John William Crabtree, a rooming house that functioned, in practice, as a brothel, and she began working as a prostitute, calling herself Phyllis to her clients and keeping her real name for people she trusted. I want to be specific about what that actually meant, practically, because the word prostitute in the Edwardian press functioned almost as a moral category rather than a description of an economic reality. Emily Dimmock worked as a sex worker because it paid better than domestic service and because, in the particular world she'd found herself in, it was available. The newspapers that covered her murder would later describe her as one of the lowest class of unfortunates, language that tells you more about those newspapers and their readers than it does about Emily. It's worth pausing on that phrase for a moment, because it does a specific kind of work in the original coverage that has shaped how this case has been written about ever since. Unfortunates was the standard Edwardian press term for women who worked as prostitutes, a word that positioned them as passive victims of circumstance rather than as people making active economic choices under the conditions actually available to them. Lowest class added a social ranking that told readers exactly where Emily sat in the hierarchy they were used to consuming. Together, the two words built a frame. Emily was pitiable, she was near the bottom, and the details of her actual life, her childhood, her relationships, her plans, were less important than her category. That framing held for most of the newspaper coverage in 1907, and for most of the writing about this case in the century since. She was a young woman from a Hertfordshire village who came to London and made economic decisions in the circumstances she actually faced, not the ones anyone would have chosen for her. That's the person we're dealing with. Not a moral category. Not a type. A specific person, 22 years old, with a documented life that began in Standon and was building toward something different. Something she and Bertram Shaw were actively constructing, however imperfectly, before the night of September 12th ended it. By 1906, that life was improving. Emily had met Bertram Shaw, a young man, possibly as young as 19, who worked as a chef in the restaurant car of the Midland Railway's Sheffield Express, the train running between Street Pancras Station in central London and Sheffield in the north of England. Shaw had proposed something unconventional by Edwardian standards, that they lived together as common-law husband and wife, with the intention of marrying properly once his parents consented. He needed parental permission because of his age. The condition he'd asked of Emily was that she give up prostitution. She'd agreed. The couple moved into the ground-floor flat at 29 St. Paul's Road, Camden Town, and by all accounts they were building something that looked, from the outside, like a genuine domestic life. Here's the complication. Whether Emily fully kept her end of that arrangement is something the trial of 1907 would expose in extensive and often humiliating public detail. She did have a regular clientele she continued to see. She met men at local pubs, principally the Eagle on Royal College Street and the Rising Sun nearby, while Bertram was away on his overnight shifts. This wasn't, as far as the documented evidence shows, a secret she kept carelessly. It was a reality she managed carefully, in the way that a woman living a double life under economic pressure tends to manage it, which is to say, more carefully than anyone around her fully appreciated, right up until the night something went catastrophically wrong. Now let's talk about Robert Wood, because understanding who he actually was, and who the press and public decided he was, matters enormously for everything that follows. Robert Wood was a designer and artist, working for a glass engraving company in the Gray's Inn Road area of central London. He was 29 years old in 1907, known in his professional and social circles as a man of some talent and considerable charm, good-looking, well-dressed by the standards of his class, with a flair for drawing and a social ease that made him comfortable in a range of company. He moved in circles connected to the artistic world of Camden Town, and was known as a man who liked the pubs and the company available in that neighborhood after working hours. It's worth understanding what artist and artistic community meant in this context, because Wood's connections shaped how his trial was perceived from the very first day. The Edwardian art world, particularly the Camden Town group forming around Sickert in this period, occupied a social position that was simultaneously respectable. Art was a recognized profession, supported by dealers and collectors, and slightly suspect. Artists inhabited the same physical spaces as working-class people, drank in the same pubs, moved through the same streets. Wood occupied this ambiguous middle ground, employed, presentable, connected to the legitimate art world, but also spending his evenings in pubs like the Eagle, where Emily Dimmock and her clients also drank. The two worlds touched at exactly the point where this case happened. Wood and Emily Dimmock appear to have met in the pubs around Camden Town at some point in the summer of 1907. On Friday, September 6, 1907, 5 days before Emily's death, they were seen together at the Eagle on Royal College Street. On that occasion, Wood produced a postcard he'd brought back from a holiday in Bruges, a Belgian city known for its medieval architecture, and wrote a message on it addressed to Emily. Not in his own name. He signed it Alice. That postcard, and the name he chose to hide behind when he wrote it, would become the central exhibit of one of the most dramatic criminal trials Edwardian England had seen. Let me walk you through what the documented evidence tells us about the final days of Emily Dimmock's life, and what the physical scene at 29 St. Paul's Road actually showed, because it's worth being specific about what is established fact and what remains contested. Wednesday, September 11, 1907. Bertram Shaw leaves for work in the early evening, heading to St. Pancras Station for his overnight shift on the Sheffield Express. Emily is in the flat. She knows his mother is coming to visit the next morning. Mrs. Shaw has disapproved of the relationship, and Bert has arranged this visit specifically to try to bring them closer, to get his mother's blessing for a proper marriage. Emily has reason to want to make a good impression. The visit matters. She has spent some effort, by the surviving accounts of her life in this period, trying to present herself as the kind of woman a railway worker's mother would approve of, and the stakes of the following morning, whatever happened the night before, were real. On top of that, she was managing the particular difficulty of a double life, the kind that requires a careful allocation of evenings and clients and excuses, and September 11th was a night when Bertram was away and the management of that life fell, as usual, entirely to her. She went to the Eagle on Royal College Street, a pub she visited regularly, the kind of local that a woman in her position used as a social base, where regular clients could find her, where the evening trade was reliable and the landlord didn't ask questions. That evening, Emily is seen at the Eagle with Robert Wood. This is the last confirmed sighting of Emily Dimmock alive. She leaves with Wood. Witnesses see them together outside. Whatever conversation they had in those final minutes outside the Eagle, whatever arrangement they made for the rest of the evening, went with Emily into the locked flat at 29 St. Paul's Road, and nobody alive has been able to fully reconstruct it since. At the flat at 29 St. Paul's Road, later that night, 2 people had supper. The remains were on the table the next morning. Food for 2 people, not 1. A detail that was noted in the initial crime scene examination and confirmed by the attending police surgeon. At some point in the early hours of September 12th, between roughly 3 and 6 in the morning, Emily was killed in her sleep. The medical evidence established the approximate window. The method was a single, deep cut to the throat, delivered with something like a straight razor. Bertram Shaw's own razor, one of a pair he kept in the flat, was found near the washstand, traces of recent use on the blade but no blood under microscopic examination, indicating the killer had cleaned it before leaving. What the physical evidence actually tells us about this crime is worth sitting with in detail, because the details don't all point in the same direction. First, the killer was someone Emily trusted enough to let into the flat, eat supper with, and allow to be present while she slept. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was locked from outside with a key when Bertram Shaw arrived home. This was not a stranger who broke in. Second, the killer was calm enough, after committing an act of extreme violence, to clean a razor, wash their hands in the basin, leaving the water bloody enough to confirm they'd done so, lock the door from outside using Emily's key, and leave. That sequence of deliberate actions under those circumstances does not fit a panicked, unplanned attack. Third, the motive is genuinely unclear. Emily's silver watch was missing. A purse containing 5 shillings and a cigarette case were gone. But Bertram's wage packet, sitting in plain view, was untouched. This could be a robbery. Or it could be something more targeted, with certain items taken to muddy the picture. And fourth, and this is the detail that has attracted the most sustained attention from researchers since 1907, somebody went through Emily's postcard collection. The cards she kept, from clients and regulars, and the particular paper trail a woman in her profession accumulated over years, were scattered across the floor. Some were missing. Whoever killed Emily Dimmock also, at some point that night, searched through those postcards. Whether they were looking for something specific, a card that connected them to her, perhaps, or a name they didn't want the police to find, or whether the ransacking was cover for some other purpose, is a question the investigation never fully resolved. What happened in the days that followed is where the case took the shape that history eventually gave it. Let us dive into the investigation because it unfolds in a sequence of reversals that is, in retrospect, a case study in how public pressure, celebrity, and class can distort the shape of a criminal inquiry almost from the first day. One thing worth establishing up front: the Metropolitan Police in 1907 was not the forensic institution it would later become. The CID had existed since 1878, but the tools available to Detective Inspector Arthur Neal when he walked into 29 St. Paul's Road on September 12 were the same tools available to any capable detective of the era: witness statements, physical evidence handled without standardized procedures, and the knowledge that a case without a named suspect tended to disappear from public pressure very quickly. No DNA analysis. No fingerprint database. Just a crime scene and the people who'd known Emily in the days before she died. Reversal 1. The initial police investigation was not lacking for suspects. Emily's life had given her a wide range of male acquaintances, several of whom had reason to be nervous about their connection to her becoming public. A mysterious man known only as Scotch Bob was an early name, allegedly someone who had threatened to cut Emily's throat over a debt or a dispute before her death. He was never identified. He was never found. He remains, in the documented record, a name and nothing more. There was also Robert Percival Roberts, the ship's cook who had spent 3 consecutive nights at the flat at St. Paul's Road in the days before the murder, while Bertram Shaw was away on railway shifts. Roberts had been at the Rising Sun on the night of September 11th, waiting for Emily, who never appeared, because she was at the Eagle with Robert Wood instead. Roberts was questioned. He had an alibi for the night of the murder and was eliminated from the inquiry. But the documented record notes that his alibi was accepted without, by most historical assessments, particularly exhaustive scrutiny. In the immediate aftermath of a sensational murder, with press pressure building by the day, a detective investigation tends to move toward its strongest apparent lead rather than systematically eliminating every alternative. The investigation stalled. Then, on September 30, 1907, 18 days after Emily's death, the News of the World, one of the most widely read newspapers in Britain, published a facsimile of a postcard found among Emily's scattered collection at the flat. It was the one Wood had written at the Eagle on September 6, signed Alice, asking Emily to meet him, and instead of writing the pub's name, he'd drawn a small sketch of a rising sun. Detective Inspector Neal had authorized its publication on the theory that someone would recognize the handwriting. Reversal 2. The theory worked, but not quite in the way anyone planned. A woman named Ruby Young saw the reproduction in the paper and recognized the handwriting immediately. She recognized it because she knew exactly whose it was: Robert Wood, her former boyfriend. She mentioned this to a friend who worked as a journalist in Fleet Street, London's newspaper district, and word reached the police within days. Here's the complication that the press largely glossed over in the excitement of having a named suspect. When Ruby Young confronted Robert Wood with what she knew, His first response was not to go to the police. It was to ask Ruby to cover for him, to say she had been with him on the evening of September 11th, which she had not. Ruby agreed, initially. She told police she'd been with Wood that evening. And then, under sustained questioning from Detective Inspector Neal, she changed her account. That sequence is one of the most significant facts in this entire case. A man whose connection to the murdered woman was identified through published evidence asked someone to lie to the police about his whereabouts. Wood was arrested on October 16, 1907, by Neal near Gray's Inn Road, shortly after a meeting with Ruby where he appeared to be again attempting to secure her silence. At Kentish Town Police Station, Wood denied knowing Emily Dimmock. Then he admitted writing the postcard. Then he admitted a casual acquaintance with her from meetings at pubs. His story changed in stages, each admission extracted rather than offered. That pattern convinced Neal he had the right man. Reversal 3. Robert Wood was a man with connections. His employer and colleagues at the glass engraving firm pooled together £1,000, a very significant sum in 1907, equivalent to several years of a working-class wage, to fund his defense. That fund secured the services of Edward Marshall Hall, the most celebrated criminal defense barrister in England. Marshall Hall was not just a skilled advocate. He was a performer, capable of turning a courtroom into a theater, and he was genuinely convinced of Wood's innocence. Whether that conviction was justified is the question this case has never fully resolved. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in December 1907 to scenes that contemporary journalists struggled to describe without reaching for theater metaphors. Seats were filled with actors, artists, writers, and society figures treating the proceedings as the best entertainment of the season. The general public crowded the streets outside. What followed was less a systematic pursuit of truth than a contest between two competing stories about who Emily Dimmock was, who Robert Wood was, and what the evidence actually meant. The prosecution's case rested on the postcard, the witness sighting of Wood and Emily leaving the Eagle together on the night of September 11th. A witness named Robert McCowan who testified he had seen a man with Wood's distinctive gait leaving St. Paul's Road at 5:55 in the morning of September 12th, and Wood's own behavior after the murder, specifically the request to Ruby Young to provide a false alibi. Here's the mid-episode question. Given what you've just heard, would you convict? A postcard connecting him to Emily 5 days before her death. A witness placing them together on the night she died. A witness identifying his distinctive walk near the flat in the early morning hours. And his own request for a false alibi. Is that enough beyond reasonable doubt? Drop your answer in the comments, because the jury had very definite views, and they reached them very quickly. Marshall Hall dismantled the prosecution case with precision. He established that the postcard proved only acquaintance, not guilt. He challenged the alibi request. Wood, he argued, had tried to conceal his connection to a murdered prostitute not because he had killed her but because the association alone would destroy him regardless of what he had actually done. That was, Hall said, the behavior of an embarrassed man, not a guilty one. He produced William Westcott, a boxer who testified that his own walk resembled the distinctive gait McCowan had attributed to Wood, and that he had been in the area that morning. If Westcott's gait could be confused with Wood's, McCowan's identification became unreliable. Hall then made the argument I find most interesting in retrospect. Wood had only asked Ruby Young to alibi him for the evening of September 11th. Not for the hours between 3 and 6 in the morning on September 12th, which were the actual hours of the murder. A guilty man, Hall argued, would have needed an account of himself during the time of the crime. Wood specifically did not seek one for those hours. That omission, Hall said, was the omission of an innocent man. And then he put Wood on the stand. The Criminal Evidence Act of 1898 had given defendants in English criminal trials the right to testify in their own defense if they chose, a right that had not existed when Franz Müller was tried in the Thomas Briggs case we covered in an earlier episode. Wood was calm, articulate, and entirely composed under cross-examination. He admitted meeting Emily. He admitted writing the postcard. He denied being in her flat on the night she died, and he denied any involvement in her death. The judge, Mr. Justice Grantham, departed significantly from convention in his summing up. A judge's summing up is supposed to present both prosecution and defense cases fairly, leaving the jury to weigh the evidence. Grantham's made clear, in language that left very little room for ambiguity, that he thought the jury should acquit. It was effectively a directed verdict from the bench, an intervention criticized in legal circles at the time and discussed in accounts of the case ever since. The jury retired at 7:45 in the evening. They were back at 8 o'clock. 15 minutes. Not guilty. Here is where I want to sit with the full picture for a moment, because what happened after that 15-minute verdict is one of the most revealing things about this case, and it has almost nothing to do with Robert Wood. Robert Wood, acquitted, walked out of the Old Bailey to something close to a hero's welcome. The crowd outside the court cheered. His employer welcomed him back. And within a relatively short period, Wood went on to tour the country's theaters and music halls, performing a stage act in which he recounted his experiences at trial, drew sketches of the witnesses and barristers who had appeared in the case, and received, by contemporary accounts, rapturous applause from audiences around England. He had gone into the Old Bailey as a murder defendant. He came out as a celebrity. He lived out the rest of his life quietly and unremarkably after the touring stopped, working in his trade, living in England, apparently untouched by any further suggestion of involvement in serious crime. He died in 1966 at the age of 87, 59 years after the night Emily Dimmock was killed. Many of his own family members, it is reported, didn't know anything about the trial until they stumbled across it in history books. Robert Wood spent most of his life being nobody in particular, which is exactly the life he might have expected if September 11, 1907, had never happened. Now here's the contrast, and it's a stark one. Ruby Young, the woman who first identified the handwriting on the postcard, who had initially agreed to lie for Wood and then told the truth under sustained police questioning, whose testimony formed a significant part of the prosecution's case, lost her position as a result of her connection to the scandal. Her name had been in the papers. Her relationship with Wood, her initial false alibi, her eventual reversal, all of it was public. And Edwardian England's tolerance for a woman whose name appeared in connection with a murder trial, a dead prostitute, and a false statement to police was approximately zero, regardless of the fact that she had ultimately told the truth. The other women who had appeared as prosecution witnesses experienced similar outcomes. Their names in the papers, their associations with the case now inescapably public, their reputations permanently marked by proximity to a victim whom the newspapers had decided represented a particular kind of moral failure. They lost jobs. Some lost homes. The specific details vary between accounts, but the pattern is consistent across every serious historical treatment of this case. The women who participated in the legal process against Robert Wood, by telling the truth about what they knew, paid a material price for it that he never paid for anything. I want to name that directly because it's not a background detail. The man who asked a woman to lie for him after a murder toured music halls and received standing ovations. The women who told the truth about what they knew of him lost their livelihoods. That outcome is not an aberration of the Edwardian legal system. It is the Edwardian legal and social system operating exactly as designed, in a way that protected men of Robert Wood's class and connections and punished women whose only transgression was knowing too much about the wrong case. Bertram Shaw lost his fiancée, his planned marriage, and the domestic life he'd been building with Emily. He was 19 or 20 years old when he came home from a night shift on the Sheffield Express and opened a locked door with a borrowed key. The historical record has relatively little to say about what happened to Bertram Shaw after 1907. He was a young working-class railway worker without powerful connections, and the press, which had covered the trial extensively, found nothing useful in his subsequent life. He passes out of the documented record as quietly as he entered it. Emily herself, of course, lost the most. And yet she became, in the public retelling of this case, the least important person in it. The trial was about Robert Wood, his innocence, his charm, Marshall Hall's virtuoso performance, the judge's extraordinary intervention. The newspapers covered it as a story about a celebrity acquittal and a legal sensation. And then, in 1908 and 1909, Walter Sickert, the painter who had been working in Camden Town at the time of Emily's death, whose studio at 6 Mornington Crescent was a 5-minute walk from where she lived and drank, produced a series of 4 paintings he called the Camden Town Murder. Dark, shadowed images of a clothed man beside a prone, nude female figure, painted in Sickert's characteristically murky palette of ochres and grays. The figures are unidentified. The compositions are deliberately ambiguous. The title does the connecting work that the images refuse to do explicitly. The paintings are, by any serious assessment, genuinely powerful works of art. They are also, by any honest reckoning, an artist making aesthetic capital from a dead woman's murder, transforming her death into atmosphere, shadow, and compositional tension, in a way that has nothing to do with who Emily Dimmock actually was and everything to do with how her death could serve a particular artistic vision. Sickert's Camden Town paintings have been exhibited, written about, and analyzed for over a century. Emily's life, her Hertfordshire childhood, her years in domestic service, her relationship with Bertram Shaw, the plans she had for a different kind of future, has attracted a fraction of that attention. And then, in 2002, the novelist Patricia Cornwell spent what was reported as several $1 million on a project to prove that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. And, by extension, the Camden Town Murderer too. Cornwell's methods included examining Sickert's paintings for microscopic DNA evidence, comparing handwriting and envelope stamps on Ripper letters to materials associated with Sickert, and constructing a circumstantial case that was, to put it plainly, rejected by most serious Ripper scholars and historians. No DNA evidence was produced that conclusively linked Sickert to anything. He had never been questioned as a suspect in 1907. He had no documented connection to Emily Dimmock. He was alive until 1942 and spent those decades as one of Britain's most celebrated painters, entirely undisturbed by any formal investigation. The Cornwell controversy generated documentaries, articles, counterarguments, and a wave of renewed public interest in the Camden Town case that lasted through the early 2000s. What it did not generate was any meaningful new attention to Emily Dimmock as a person. It was, like almost everything else that had attached itself to this case since 1907, fundamentally about someone else. A famous painter. A Victorian serial killer. The woman in the bed at 29 St. Paul's Road remained, throughout, the occasion for other people's stories. So, let's ask clearly the question the case itself demands. If not Wood, then who? There are several documented candidates the formal investigation either didn't fully pursue or couldn't resolve. The man known as Scotch Bob, the early suspect who allegedly threatened Emily's life before her death, was never identified, never traced, and remains in the record as a name only. He could be significant. He could be a rumor. The documented record cannot say which. Robert Percival Roberts, the ship's cook, is a more interesting case. He had spent 3 consecutive nights at the flat that week, had intimate knowledge of the rooms, and had been at the Rising Sun on September 11th specifically expecting to meet Emily, who stood him up because she was at the Eagle with Wood. A man who knew the flat, knew the layout, had a key to the dynamic of Emily's double life, and had a documented reason to feel wronged on the very night she died. That is, on the face of it, a more direct proximate line of suspicion than a postcard written 5 days earlier. His alibi was accepted by Detective Inspector Neal without, by most historical assessments, particularly exhaustive scrutiny. Whether that was an oversight or a justified investigative conclusion, the record cannot now resolve. And then there is the person researcher John Barber named after 4 years of primary source investigation, a man connected to Emily's earlier life in Camden Town, with means, opportunity, and a documented connection to the world she moved in before Bertram Shaw. Barber's methodology, going back to Emily's life before 1907 rather than starting from the postcard and working forward, represents exactly the kind of victim-centered investigation the original inquiry never really conducted. I'm not going to present his candidate as established fact, because it isn't. What I will say is that the line of inquiry Barber followed, starting with who Emily was, not with what evidence pointed most conveniently at a named suspect, is the line the 1907 investigation should have followed more thoroughly and didn't. The honest answer is that the documented record does not tell us who killed Emily Dimmock. What it does tell us is that the investigation focused very heavily on Robert Wood once his connection to the postcard was established, that alternative lines of inquiry were not pursued with comparable rigor, and that the trial, whatever its outcome, was never really a search for the truth about what happened at 29 St. Paul's Road in the early hours of September 12, 1907. It was a contest between a prosecution theory and a defense performance, refereed by a judge who had already made up his mind before an audience that had come for the spectacle. The Camden Town murder was never officially solved. No one was ever convicted of Emily Dimmock's death. The case remains, in the formal sense, open, one of thousands of Victorian and Edwardian unsolved murders that sit in archive boxes and digitized newspaper databases, generating occasional articles, occasional books, and very occasionally a new theory about who was really responsible. What the case actually resolved, decisively if not satisfyingly, was the question of what would happen to Robert Wood. He walked free, lived to old age, and became a minor footnote in the history of British criminal law, the first defendant in a British murder trial to testify in his own defense and be acquitted. That's the legal legacy most often cited when the case comes up in criminal history contexts. Whether that footnote is an account of a just outcome or a famous miscarriage depends on what you believe about the evidence. And the honest answer is that the evidence is thin enough and contested enough that certainty in either direction isn't warranted. Wood's acquittal had a specific legal significance beyond the celebrity drama surrounding it. The Criminal Evidence Act of 1898 had been on the books for less than a decade when Wood took the stand, and there was still genuine debate in legal circles about whether a defendant testifying in their own defense was tactically wise or dangerous, whether it would help or hurt, whether juries would treat it as a demonstration of innocence or an opportunity to be destroyed under cross-examination. Wood's performance was cited afterward as evidence that a defendant who could hold up under Marshall Hall's preparation and the prosecution's cross-examination had a real chance of humanizing themselves to a jury in a way that no amount of advocacy from a barrister on their behalf could fully replicate. In that narrow legal sense, the Camden Town trial did matter. It helped establish a norm that defendants would eventually routinely be advised to exercise. Edward Marshall Hall went on to several more celebrated defenses in the years that followed. His reputation secured and amplified by the Wood acquittal, his name attached in legal textbooks to a particular style of theatrical, jury-centered advocacy that valued emotional intelligence and physical presence in the courtroom as much as legal argument. He remained one of the most famous barristers in British legal history until his death in 1927. The Camden Town case is among the crown jewels of his career. He never seems to have expressed any doubt about Wood's innocence. Mr. Justice Grantham, the judge who effectively directed the acquittal from the bench, was criticized in legal circles at the time for the partiality of his summing up. The criticism didn't produce any formal consequence. Edwardian English law had no robust mechanism for correcting judicial conduct of this kind after the fact, and the acquittal stood unreviewable. Grantham himself died in 1911, for years after the trial. Whether he believed he had done justice to Emily Dimmock, or merely justice to the man in the dock, the record does not say. Detective Inspector Arthur Neal, the investigating officer, was reportedly convinced until the end of his career that Robert Wood had killed Emily Dimmock. His personal conviction, professionally irrelevant after the acquittal but documented in retrospective accounts, is the kind of detail that tends to attach itself to unsolved cases because it keeps the official version from settling too comfortably into "this was resolved." Neal rose to the rank of superintendent within the Metropolitan Police and wrote a memoir that touched on the Camden Town case, among others. He never stopped believing he had arrested the right man. Whether he was right is something the legal system declined to confirm or deny. Walter Sickert's Camden Town Murder paintings now hang in major galleries and private collections. They are among the most discussed works in his catalog. Not because of any proven connection to a real killing, but because of what they do aesthetically with violence, gender, and the nude figure in an Edwardian interior. The Patricia Cornwell controversy gave them a new wave of public attention in the early 2000s, generating documentaries, articles, and a sustained argument that faded without resolution. Sickert died in 1942 at the age of 81. Having spent the decade since 1907 as one of Britain's most celebrated painters, entirely undisturbed by any formal investigation. His 4 paintings titled The Camden Town Murder remain, for many people, the most famous cultural artifact connected to this case. Emily Dimmock's name is rarely the first thing mentioned when they come up. Emily, who was born in a Hertfordshire village, came to London and built a life in Camden Town and was going to get married and was killed in her sleep on September 12, 1907, while her fiancé was on a train to Sheffield. She is buried in the churchyard at Hitchin, Hertfordshire, not far from where she was born. A headstone marks the grave. The inscription, if you look for it, is simple: her name, her age, her dates. In 2002, when the Cornwell argument was making headlines, a researcher named John Barber, whose interest in the case had started with a family history inquiry from a man whose relative had known Emily, completed 4 years of research and named, in his own assessment, the person he believed had killed her. His candidate was not Robert Wood. It was not Walter Sickert. It was a man connected to Emily's life through her earlier years in Camden Town. Someone with means, opportunity, and a documented connection to the world she moved in. Barber's 4 years of work produced what he described as a probable answer, not a certain one. The police in 1907 did not investigate this person with the same focus they gave to Robert Wood. Whether that was an investigative failure, a product of class assumptions about which leads were worth following, or simply a consequence of the postcard pointing such a clear arrow at an available suspect, is something the record cannot now resolve. What I can tell you is this. Somebody killed Emily Dimmock in her sleep on the night of September 11th into September 12, 1907, in a flat at 29 St. Paul's Road, Camden Town. They ate supper with her first. They cleaned up afterward. They took the house keys and locked the door behind them. They went through her postcards and took some. And then they walked away into the London morning, and nobody ever proved who they were, and nobody was ever held responsible, and the trial that followed produced a legal celebrity and a famous acquittal and a judge's controversial summing up and a great deal of newspaper copy, and left Emily Dimmock as what one historian described as the almost forgotten extra in a much greater drama. I don't think that's good enough. I'm not sure what good enough looks like, more than a century later, with no new physical evidence available and all the primary witnesses long dead. But I think naming it matters. She wasn't extra to her own story. She was the story. Bertram Shaw lost his fiancé and his self-respect, in that order, and spent the rest of his life carrying both losses. Ruby Young told the truth under pressure and was punished for it. And Emily Dimmock, born in Standon, Hertfordshire, on October 20, 1884, died in Camden Town on September 12, 1907, and nobody has ever been made to answer for it. The flat on St. Paul's Road, now renamed Agar Grove, still stands. The Eagle Pub on Royal College Street, where she spent her last evening, still serves customers on the same Camden Town corner. The postcards that were scattered across her floor that morning, the ones that weren't taken, eventually made their way into evidence files, and from evidence files into the kind of archive boxes that hold everything a life left behind that wasn't claimed. Nobody answered for it. Not in 1907. Not since. The case is closed in the sense that no investigation is carried out and no suspect is being pursued. It is open in every other sense, in the sense that the truth of what happened between 3 and 6 in the morning at 29 St. Paul's Road on September 12, 1907, remains unconfirmed, and the person responsible for ending Emily Dimmock's life walked away from it without ever being held to account by anyone. That's the kind of ending this story has. Not a verdict. Not a confession. Not a cold case solved a century later by a database match or a deathbed letter. Just an unanswered question sitting inside a locked flat in Camden Town on a September morning, while the woman who could have answered it lay on a bed she would never get out of. Emily Dimmock was 22 years old. She had curling pins in her hair when she died, because she expected to wake up in the morning and take them out. She was going to get married. She had plans. The case is still open. Her name is on a headstone in Hertfordshire. Both of those things are true, and only one of them was ever supposed to be. Somebody knows what happened in that flat, or knew before they died, or took the knowledge with them into a life that the press and the courts and the art world never thought worth examining, because the artist, the barrister, the acquitted man, and the famous painter were all more interesting stories than the woman on the bed who started all of it. Emily Dimmock was the story. She still is. Nobody answered for her. The least this episode can do is say her name like it matters, because it does. If you're into true crime documentaries that go past the verdict to ask who was really served by justice, subscribe to Enter the Crime, and tell us in the comments. Do you think Robert Wood was guilty?